What time is it where you are? Are you listening from a warm bed or walking slowly in the dark? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we return to ancient Rome. Not the Rome of columns and glory, not the marble statues or the sainted chambers echoing with the word libertas, but the Rome that ruled with mirrors, masks, and madness. The Rome where emperors didn't just make laws, they were the law. Living gods wrapped in silk and fear. And the rules they invented, whenever meant for mortals, they were twisted, strange, fragile, and they held an empire hostage, one decree at a time. Let's begin, not with Julius Caesar, but with a man who came after the assassins had wiped the blood off their togas. Let's begin with the boy who became Augustus. When the gods no longer answered, they made themselves into gods. Augustus wasn't born. Augustus. His name was Gaius Octavius, a careful, pale boy raised in the outer folds of aristocracy. But when his great-uncle Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor, young Octavius inherited something more dangerous than land. He inherited the idea of power, and the rules began to change. In the days of the Republic, power had been negotiated, voted on, whispered through Senate benches. But Octavius, now calling himself Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, meaning son of the divine Caesar, rewrote that quietly. He called it the Principate, not a monarchy, not a dictatorship, just a first citizen, and surrounded by rituals so subtle you didn't notice they replaced the state. He took the symbols of a republic, the laws, the elections, the consulship, and wore them like a mask, and behind that mask, the first rule twisted into shape. Rule 1, call yourself humble, and rule like a god. He let the people believe they still had choices. He let the Senate believe it still mattered. And he built temples, not to Mars or Jupiter, but to himself. He didn't outlaw the Republic, he embalmed it, propped it up like a corpse in golden robes, and everyone clapped. In this new Rome, loyalty wasn't just expected, it was staged. Augustus believed that rituals shaped belief. So he filled the city with ceremonies. Birthdays were no longer family matters, they were civic events. Augustus's own birthday was turned into a national holiday. Every 5 years, the Ludi Seculares would be performed. Sacred games to cleanse the empire and remind the people who sat closest to the gods. Citizens were encouraged to hang his portrait in their homes, not by law, but by example. Statues of Augustus multiplied across the empire, not towering and brutal but idealized, always calm, always young, his brows set just slightly above mortal concern. And so the second rule bloomed. Rule 2, make the empire worship your reflection, not your reality. But Rome had many gods, and one throne. The problem with creating a system where the emperor is semi-divine, where his image is painted across every wall, is this: what happens when the next emperor isn't a god? What happens when he's just a man, or worse, a boy? After Augustus died, his stepson Tiberius took the throne, and the rules bent a little further. Tiberius didn't care for the games. He avoided the public. He ruled from a distance. And then he left Rome entirely. He moved to the island of Capri, and from his seaside palace he governed by letter, by rumor, and by fear. In the villas of Capri, new rituals were invented: silent servants, private guards, banished senators, and shadows. They say Tiberius would whisper commands no one understood, vague, delicate orders that left men executed without cause, their names scraped from monuments. He didn't rule through spectacle, he ruled through silence. Rule 3. Disappear and become a myth. No one knew what pleased him, so they guessed. No one knew what laws were sacred, so they obeyed everything. Even the air grew heavier when his name was spoken. And so Rome learned another rule. Rule 4. Fear is more effective when no one can explain it. By the time Caligula came to power, the rules snapped. If Augustus disguised his power, and Tiberius hoarded it, then Caligula unwrapped it, drank it, and poured it over everything he touched. He was the emperor who rode a horse into the Senate, not because the horse was wise, but because Caligula could. He declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, and ordered his legions to gather seashells as spoils. He built floating palaces on ships larger than temples, bathed in perfumes thick as oil, and forced noblemen to run beside his chariot like dogs. He did not want to be admired. He wanted to be feared and loved and envied all at once. And so he broke the mask. Rule 5. Make your madness into law and call it divinity, and still the empire obeyed. Because once the rules had bent, they could not be unbent. Once you tell a people that an emperor is not just mortal but sacred, not just sacred but eternal, how do you punish him? You don't. You watch. You bow. You survive. Until the knives come out again. As the twilight settled over Rome's rooftops, and oil lamps flickered in the corners of tiled villas, the people of the empire lived beneath a rulebook they couldn't read, a rulebook that shifted with every passing breath of the emperor. Each new ruler added pages not with ink, but with silence, spectacle, or cruelty. And what began with Augustus as the illusion of a gentle first citizen, a princeps, had now become a throne surrounded by fog and knives. The people were no longer certain what Rome stood for. They only knew who sat above it. And even that could change in a whisper. Let us drift now to the years after Caligula, when the chaos did not end, but changed shape. Claudius, the rule of the underdog after Caligula, was assassinated in a whirlwind of whispers and hidden blades, in the halls of his own palace. No less, Rome turned its gaze to an unlikely successor, Claudius. He was never meant to rule. Limping, stuttering, and considered a fool by his own family, Claudius had spent most of his life in the shadows of the palace, reading books while others chased power. He was mocked, dismissed, and hidden behind curtains during official events. Even Caligula had kept him as a kind of pet, a living embarrassment to the family lineage. But when the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguards, found Claudius cowering behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination, something unexpected happened. They didn't kill him. They proclaimed him emperor. The Senate was stunned. Claudius, who had never commanded an army, who had never run for office, who limped and stammered, was now the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. And he took the throne quietly. But once seated, Claudius proved something dangerous. Rule 6. The underestimated emperor is the most dangerous of all. Because no one expected him to succeed, Claudius was free to move in silence. He reformed laws, expanded the empire into Britannia, and executed those who laughed too loudly. He smiled, nodded, and signed death warrants with the same hand he used to hold his scrolls. In a court of peacocks and wolves, Claudius was the owl, silent, blinking and watching. His greatest weapon, surprise, his downfall, love, the poison in the palace. Claudius married several times, but it was his final wife, Agrippina the Younger, who would twist the knife of destiny. Agrippina was no naive consort. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the niece of Caligula, and the sister of power itself. She had ambition, and a son named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. You may know him by his imperial name, Nero. To ensure her son's future, Agrippina allegedly poisoned Claudius with a dish of mushrooms, the food of the gods, and so the quiet rule of the owl ended, with a whisper and a convulsion, and in its place came something far more theatrical. Nero, the stage becomes the throne. If Claudius represented the surprise of intellect over appearance, Nero flipped the formula entirely. He was young, handsome, flamboyant. He believed in art more than administration. He sang, he played the lyre, he performed plays, and he ruled Rome like it was his personal stage. Rule 7. If you can't be feared, be adored, or pretend until they believe it. Nero flooded the empire with imagery, of himself as Apollo, as Orpheus, as the sun god himself. He hosted orgies disguised as religious festivals. He built a golden house, the Domus Aurea, at the center of the capital, where once poor tenements had stood. And then, one night, Rome burned. For 6 days, fire consumed the city. No one knew how it started, but the whispers came quickly. Nero had lit it himself, and to clear space for his palace, to sing as the city screamed. It may not be true, but what mattered in Rome was never the truth, only the performance, and the people began to see the emperor's crown not as a laurel, but a mask, silencing the bloodline. Nero's paranoia grew. He ordered the murder of his mother, the very Agrippina who had seated him on the throne. She had become too controlling, too clever, too visible. They say he tried to kill her with a collapsing boat first. When she swam ashore, soaking wet but alive, he had her stabbed. Then his wife, Poppaea, died, allegedly at his own hands during a fit of rage. Senators who criticized him vanished, poets were exiled, and Rome learned another of the twisted rules. Rule 8. Kill the ones who made you, and before they unmake you. But paranoia doesn't end with murder. It expands. By the end of Nero's reign, his enemies were not just in the Senate or in his family. They were in the wind, in the stones, in the shadows. Rebellion bloomed in distant provinces, and the Senate, at last, turned on him. Nero fled the city, alone, forgotten. And when the guards came for him, he took his own life with trembling hands, muttering his last words. What an artist dies in me. Galba and the year of 4 emperors, what followed was not peace, but a storm. The year after Nero's death, 4 men claimed the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Each ruled for mere months. Each was elevated by armies, then devoured by betrayal. Rule 9. Once the throne bleeds, it will not stop. Galba marched into Rome like a general, strict and cold, cutting the wages of soldiers and refusing to bribe his way to favor. He was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. Otho rose next, a man who had once been Nero's ally, now playing the role of moderate emperor. He ruled for 95 days. Vitellius followed, decadent, greedy, gluttonous. He was dragged through the streets and executed. And finally Vespasian, a general from the east, stepped in. He did not sing, he did not play. He built, he raised taxes, rebuilt the treasury, and began the construction of the Flavian amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum. Vespasian understood something vital. Rule 10, if you want to last, stop acting like a god. But the rules weren't gone. They simply evolved. The emperors that followed, Titus, Domitian, Trajan, All carried shadows of the past. Each new decree was wrapped in caution, cloaked in symbolism, and signed in the memory of madness. Rome had seen what happened when a man believed himself divine. It had lived through fire, through poisoned mushrooms, through seashell wars and singing funerals, and so the empire adopted a new kind of twisted rule. Rule 11. Pretend to be sane, even if you're not. Smile during executions. Build temples for the gods, but whisper your name in the corners. Let the people believe in peace, while your enemies quietly vanish. And always remember, the crown in Rome was never made of gold. It was forged from fear, wrapped in ritual and balanced on the edge of a sword. The ashes of the Julio-Claudian dynasty had long cooled, yet the throne remained hot. Rome, eternal, insatiable, still required an emperor. But by now the seat of power had changed. No longer a divine bloodline, no longer a divine right. The emperorship had become something else entirely, a prize, a dangerous gleaming prize passed between generals and politicians, assassins and aristocrats. And all who reached for it had to play by the unspoken rules, those twisted commandments that governed not the law but the survival of the lawgiver. It was not the Senate nor the gods, nor the people who decided who would rule. It was the whispers in the barracks, the coins struck in haste, the eyes behind the curtain, and so we descend. Further into the age of survival, where emperors came not with fanfare, but with footprints on the backs of those who came before them. Domitian, shadows of control. After Vespasian and the brief, almost gentle reign of his son Titus, the imperial torch fell to Domitian. He had watched, waited, and learned. If Nero had ruled by performance, Domitian would rule by control. His face was carved into every coin. His title, Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, was whispered in the Senate and shouted in temples. He rebuilt Rome's economy, its armies, its frontiers, but with every success came fear. He was paranoid, secretive. His palace swarmed with spies. He trusted no one, not senators, not servants, not even statues. He had some removed for casting shadows he disliked. Rule 12. An emperor must never sleep in the same bed twice. Domitian rotated sleeping chambers nightly, evading assassins even in dreams. He had mirrors placed across hallways to catch those who crept too quietly. He hosted banquets where the food was served on black marble, and the guests were told they would not survive the night, only to be released at dawn. His twisted rules were no longer rumors. They were rituals. He was stabbed in the belly by his own chamberlain. His reign ended not with rebellion, but a whispered signal and a dagger behind a curtain. Trajan. The empire at its height, and then came Trajan, a soldier, a builder, a man of iron discipline. He expanded Rome to its furthest borders. The empire grew fat under his reign, swelling into Mesopotamia, Dacia, and beyond. His name echoed in every garrison, in every grain shipment, in every roadstone. But Trajan was different. He didn't claim to be a god. He didn't perform plays or demand worship. Rule 13. The strongest emperors rule without needing to remind anyone. Trajan was loved, which made him dangerous. The Senate didn't fear him. The army revered him. The people cheered him. He never needed to look over his shoulder, because no one wanted him gone. And yet, that too became a kind of rule. A golden thread of expectation for every emperor that followed. A burden, because how do you follow a man who built the empire's greatest monuments and left no enemies alive? Hadrian. Walls and whispers. Hadrian, Trajan's successor, ruled not with conquest, but with boundaries. He built walls, literal and political. Hadrian's Wall in Britain was more than just a defensive structure. It was a message, this far and no farther. The empire would expand no more. He dressed plainly, travelled constantly, and embraced Greek culture more than Roman. He grew a beard, uncommon for emperors, and read philosophy. But he also executed senators who disagreed with him. He rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman city, sparking violent rebellion. And in his final years, plagued by illness, he isolated himself behind layers of guards and courtiers, giving orders by messenger from a villa soaked in silence. Rule 14. Distance is power. Mystery is protection. Hadrian ruled by absence, by the illusion of thoughtfulness, by appearing everywhere and nowhere, and as his health faded, so too did the clarity of his reign. He adopted a successor not once but twice, first choosing Lucius Aelius, who died mysteriously, then Antoninus Pius, under the condition he adopt Marcus Aurelius. This delicate chain of adoptions, formalized by legal theatre, showed yet another rule. Rule 15. Adopt legacy. Blood is too dangerous. Antoninus Pius, the quiet emperor rarely remembered, Antoninus Pius reigned for over 2 decades, a stretch of calm rarely seen in Roman history. He fought no major wars. He passed no theatrical laws. He ruled from behind the scenes, respecting Senate traditions and keeping the Praetorian Guard content. He was, by most accounts, a model emperor, but calm in Rome is not memorable. And the next storm had already begun to form. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher. King Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most famous of Rome's emperors among modern minds, was a paradox, a stoic, a scholar, a warrior. His meditations, written in the field while campaigning against Germanic tribes, remain one of the most revered philosophical texts in Western history. But his reign was not peaceful. Plague swept through the empire. Frontiers cracked under pressure. And behind his calm thoughts was a man haunted by war, grief, and one fatal decision. Rule 16. The philosopher may be wise, but wisdom cannot predict blood. Marcus broke the chain of adoptions. He named his son Commodus as successor. The empire would suffer for it. Commodus, the empire. As a circus, Commodus fancied himself a gladiator. He fought in the arena, staged battles, of course, against blunted weapons or exhausted opponents. He wore lion skins, posed as Hercules, and renamed Rome itself after his own honorifics. He flooded the empire with statues of himself as a god, muscles bulging, club raised. Rule 17. If they won't love you, force them to cheer. His rule was one of decadence and delirium. He renamed months after himself. He charged the Senate with treason if they showed signs of boredom. He watched executions with joy and sometimes performed them. Eventually the court revolted. His mistress poisoned him. His wrestling partner strangled him in his bath. The empire breathed and choked. The crisis of the 3rd century then came collapse. In less than 50 years, Rome cycled through more than 20 emperors. Some ruled for weeks, others for hours. Rule 18. When emperors fall too easily, the throne becomes a trap. Emperors were raised by legions, assassinated by rivals, declared by cities, denied by provinces. The empire split. Borders were lost, coins were debased, faith was shaken, and through it all one thing remained constant. The rules had twisted so far. They no longer resembled rules at all. They were instincts, reflexes. A kind of imperial madness passed from one ruler to the next like a cursed torch. And as Rome struggled to remember what it had once been, a republic in name only, a god machine, a family project, a military state, one last figure would rise, a man not of noble blood, not of philosophy, but of reform. The empire was cracked. Its spine had been snapped and reset so many times it no longer stood straight. Its borders had frayed, its gold had thinned, and its emperors, well, no one really knew who the emperor was anymore. A few even ruled at the same time. In Gaul, an emperor. In Syria, another. In Rome, a third. Each claimed legitimacy. Each minted coins. Each raised legions. And each, by the unwritten yet deeply felt rule of imperial Rome, knew that the only path to true power was not just survival, but annihilation of every other claimant. It was not a war of nations, it was a war of names, of busts on coins, of names on edicts, of who got to sit in the center of a broken wheel. Then from the shadows of this chaos came Diocletian. Diocletian, the architect of division, no divine blood, no family legacy, no oratory brilliance. Diocletian had risen from the ranks of the army, step by brutal step. And when his turn came, when the throne was left vacant once again by sword and whisper, he took it, not as a Caesar, but as a problem solver. Rome, he declared, could not be ruled by one man, not any more, not with its sprawl, its fractures, its weight. So he invented the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each ruled a section of the empire. East and west, split and mirrored. Rule 19. When the world is too heavy, build more shoulders beneath it. It was bureaucratic. It was practical. It was, on paper, brilliant. And yet, Diocletian also understood the theater. He wore robes of imperial purple so richly dyed, it nearly bankrupted regions. He reintroduced full bowing and kissing of feet to approach the emperor. He surrounded himself with gold, not senators. He called himself Dominus, Lord. Rule 20. If you must divide the empire, multiply the symbols of power. He retired voluntarily. In 305 AD, a nearly unthinkable act, he stepped away from the most powerful role in the world to grow cabbages, literally. That's what he did. And when begged to return during later crises, he famously answered, "If you could see the cabbages I grow with my own hands, you wouldn't ask me to return to power." It was the most twisted rule of all. Rule 21. The only emperor who wins is the one who walks away. Constantine, sword and cross. Then came Constantine, the man who would take the blood-soaked, fractured empire and wrap it in something entirely new, a symbol that had once meant death. The cross. Constantine's rise was ruthless. He fought rival emperors, including his own brother-in-law, in a series of brutal battles. At the Milvian Bridge, before one decisive engagement, legend says he saw a vision, the Chi-Rho, the first letters of Christ's name in Greek. "In this sign you will conquer." He painted it on shields, helmets, standards. He won, and then he legalized Christianity. Rule 22. To conquer Rome, conquer its gods, or replace them. Constantine would go further. He founded a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of Byzantium. It was cleaner, wealthier, and closer to the shifting frontiers. He ruled both as emperor and as God's chosen instrument. Not a priest, not a pope, but something harder to define, a Christian warlord in an empire not yet Christian, he still murdered rivals, still executed his own son and wife, still maintained the trappings of traditional imperial cults for decades, because even with a new religion, the old rules remained. Rule 23. Change the gods. Keep the throne. Julian the Apostate, the last pagan Julian, a descendant of Constantine, saw what was happening. Rome was becoming something else. The temples were silent, the old rites fading, the Senate limp and spineless under bishops and holy men. Julian had survived massacres in his youth that wiped out most. Of his family, he studied secretly, worshipped the old gods, and when his turn came, he tried to turn back time. He stripped the church of its privileges, reopened pagan temples, restored sacrifices, omens, and priesthoods. He even wrote satirical essays mocking Christianity, calling it a religion of gravediggers and beggars. Rule 24. If you must challenge the tide, bring the storm with you. But Julian's reign was brief. He died on campaign in Persia, reportedly with the words, "You have won, Galilean." Whether said with rage or surrender, we'll never know. His death marked the end of the old gods in the halls of Roman power, Theodosius and the final divide. By the time Theodosius reigned, the empire was still one beast, east and west, in name, but in spirit, in culture, in weight. It had already split. Theodosius banned pagan rites outright, closed temples, elevated Christianity to not just tolerance, but dominance. Rule 25. To rule forever, rule souls as well as swords. When he died in 395 AD, he left the empire to his two sons. One ruled the east, one ruled the west. They would never rule together again. The fall of the West, what followed, was not collapse. Not instantly. It was erosion, barbarian pressures, internal corruption, too many generals, too few soldiers, a Senate that debated marble procurement while the city gates shuddered. In 476 AD, Romulus Augustulus, a boy, was deposed by a barbarian chieftain named Odoacer. No bloody coup, no grand funeral, no fire in the sky, just a child's name removed from a list. Rule 26. Empires end not with screams, but with forgetting. And yet, the East endured, Constantinople stood. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, continued for almost 1,000 years. They still called themselves Romans, they still followed many of the same imperial rules, twisted further still. Emperors blinded rivals instead of killing them. They bribed enemies with marriages. They built walls that held for centuries, until they didn't. But that's a different story. The final rules, so what? Did we learn, truly learn, from the twisted rules of Rome's emperors? Rule 1. The gods do not choose emperors, the soldiers do. Rule 6. Kill your rivals before they dine. Rule 11. If you fear the gods, become one. Rule 19. When the world is too heavy, build more shoulders beneath it. Rule 23. Change the gods, keep the throne. Rule 26. Empires end not with screams, but with forgetting. These were not laws. They were blood-wrapped survival instincts written into the skin of every man who ever dared sit on the throne of Rome, and one by one they all broke them, and one by one they all fell. By the time the dust had settled over the Western Empire, the names of men who once ruled all of civilization had become shadows in forgotten inscriptions. The statues crumbled, their noses gone, their names scratched off by the next ruler, the next god-king, the next forgettable face. But in the East the rules were just beginning to mutate. because while the Roman West had burned, the Roman East had learned. They learned to survive not just by conquest, but by illusion. And so, we enter the court of Byzantium. The imperial throne had moved to Constantinople. The names had changed, the gods had shifted, and Latin was fading into Greek. But the rules of Roman emperorship had not softened. They had sharpened. They had twisted further. And now, new emperors would rise with robes soaked in incense, with ceremonies stretching for hours, and with a mask of divinity so complete, no one could even remember the face beneath it. Let us begin with the most curious of these rulers, Justinian and the theatre of rule. He was not born into power. Justinian was the nephew of an emperor who himself had once been a swineherd. But Justinian was ambitious, not loud, not erratic, just cold and thorough. Where others used swords, he used legal codes and taxes. But behind Justinian stood something even more powerful than gold or steel. A woman, Theodora, a former actress, a woman who, by Roman standards, would have been considered unclean. Yet Justinian raised her to the status of Augusta, not consort, not wife, co-ruler. Rule 27. When power is denied to one hand, hold the sword with both. Together they ruled not by charisma, but by construction. He rebuilt Constantinople after the Nika riots razed it. He commissioned the Hagia Sophia, a dome so high it seemed to touch the heavens. He codified centuries of Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation of legal systems for 1,000 years. But he was not merciful. He crushed dissent. He raised taxes until whole provinces collapsed. He sent armies to reconquer parts of the West temporarily. Justinian did not believe in rule by love. He believed in permanence. Rule 28. If the world will not remember your face, make it remember your walls. And still, he failed to keep the peace. The plague came. His armies crumbled. His city starved. His people prayed. And Justinian did not die, but everything else did. The rule of shadows. Heraclius and the cross-generations passed. Then came Heraclius. When he came to power, the empire was again splintered. The Persians had taken Jerusalem. The true cross, believed to be the actual crucifixion cross, had been stolen. Heraclius did not sit on a throne. He strapped on armor. He marched eastward, through Anatolia, and into the heart of Persia. He reclaimed the cross. He brought it back to Jerusalem. And yet, while the people wept and rang bells and hailed him as a holy warrior king, a new force had awakened on the horizon. From the deserts of Arabia, a unifying storm under the banner of Islam surged. By the end of Heraclius's reign, much of the empire's eastern land, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, was lost. He had brought back the cross, yes, but the empire had traded land for relics. Rule 29. Victory in symbols is defeat in silence. The rule of blinding Basil the Bulgar slayer. Now we speak of a darker time, of Basil II. He ruled for nearly 50 years, one of the longest reigns in Roman history. And while others ruled with pageantry or piety, Basil ruled with silence. He did not throw games. He did not build churches. He fought. His primary enemy, the Bulgars, a kingdom to the north. For decades they battled. Basil was patient. He trained his troops, outflanked alliances, and eventually he broke their armies. At the Battle of Clydion, he captured 15,000 enemy soldiers. He did not kill them. He blinded them, all of them. Each group of 100 was left with one soldier, who had a single eye to guide the rest back to their king. When Tsar Samuel saw his blinded army return, he died of shock. Basil earned his name. Rule 30. To rule with fear, leave no room for hope. And yet, Basil died childless. He left behind a full treasury, a vast empire, and no heir who could hold it. The rules had held, but the line had broken. The rule of pretenders. Constantine. Knights and the decline time wore away at Byzantium like sea on stone. Where once emperors were soldiers, now they were philosophers. Where once emperors starved for war, now they gorged on ceremonies. Enter Constantine IX. Elegant, scholarly, detached. He spent extravagantly. He built churches and libraries, but he neglected the army. And on the edges of the empire enemies gathered, the Normans in the west, the Seljuk Turks in the east. It was under his line that the Battle of Manzikert occurred, a devastating loss to the Turks. The Roman heartland of Anatolia was shattered. The empire would never truly recover. Rule 31. When you build your throne on parchment, be ready to bleed in ink. The Byzantines would write treaties. Send embassies, appeal to the Pope, call on crusaders. But every plea was another admission. They were no longer the Rome that conquered. They were the Rome that negotiated. The rule of smoke, Alexios and the Crusaders. Then came Alexios the Theou Komnenos, and with him, the twisted rule of survival through illusion. He ruled during the First Crusade. He invited Western armies to help reclaim lost territory. And they came. They came not as guests, but as conquerors. The Byzantines saw strange knights with crosses on their chests and hunger in their eyes. Alexios promised them supplies, gold, safe, passage. But in his chambers he whispered instructions for them to go. Elsewhere, he diverted them toward Jerusalem away from Constantinople, let them burn their way through someone else's lands. Rule 32. When wolves arrive in your garden, point them toward your neighbor's field. Alexios saved his empire for but he'd opened the door to something far worse. Western curiosity and Western greed. One day they'd come back, not as crusaders, but as looters. The rules no longer belonged to the Senate. They no longer belonged to the legions. They didn't even belong to the emperor. They belonged to the idea of the emperor. And that idea was now stretched so thin it glimmered like a dying flame in a cracked lantern. The empire staggered forward under the weight of centuries, not from the strength of its rulers, but from the sheer momentum of tradition. By now, Rome no longer ruled from Rome. It ruled from Constantinople. But it also ruled from memory, and memory is a cruel master. The rule of gold. Irene, the empress, without eyes in a world still governed by men and Mars, came a ruler who changed everything, by breaking every rule. Her name was Irene of Athens. She began as the wife of Emperor Leo IV, but after his death she became regent to her young son, Constantine VI. At first it was innocent, guiding a child too small to sit upon the imperial throne. But the empire quickly learned. Irene had no intention of stepping aside. She styled herself not just as regent, but as ruler. She sat alone on the throne. She signed decrees without her son's name. And when he came of age and dared to assert himself, Irene had him blinded, not in secret, not as punishment, as a political maneuver, her own son. Rule 33. The blood of the emperor is not sacred if it stains your path to power. After that, Irene declared herself emperor, not empress. She ruled in her own name, the first woman to do so in the empire's long history. The church hesitated. The people whispered. But for nearly 5 years she held the throne, and then the West responded. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in the West because they said, a woman could not hold the Roman title, and in doing so the empire was officially split in two. Irene ruled with gold. She poured money into diplomacy and appearances, but the treasury shrank, the army weakened, and eventually the court turned on her. She died exiled, surrounded not by senators, but nuns. Rule 34. Power wears pearls just as easily as it wears swords, but it dies the same. The rule of collapse, the Fourth Crusade. The twisted rules of the Roman emperors did not only trap those on the throne, they infected those around them. As the centuries passed, emperors became increasingly fragile, their crowns heavier, their thrones more gilded and more fragile. Then came the Fourth Crusade. The emperor at the time, Alexios IV Angelos, made a deal with the Crusaders. He had been exiled, his father deposed. He promised the invading Westerners gold, ships, supplies, if they helped restore him, and they did. They sacked the outer walls, restored Alexios to the throne. But there was no gold, no ships, no gratitude. Alexios couldn't pay. The Crusaders waited, and when the gold didn't come, they turned on the city. In 1204, Constantinople fell, not to Persians, not to Turks, not to invaders from the east, but to fellow Christians from the west. The city was burned, its churches looted, its relics scattered, the empire shattered. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, Constantinople was no longer Roman. Rule 35. Never promise a wolf dinner unless you have meat in hand. This was not just a fall, it was betrayal, it was irony, it was the perfect ending to the twisted saga of imperial rule, except it wasn't the end. The Byzantines clawed back. A new dynasty rose, but the empire had been broken into pieces, and each piece followed new rules. The rule of pretend, the Palaiologos dynasty when Michael VIII. Palaiologos reclaimed Constantinople in 1261. He did not find an empire waiting to be restored. He found ruins, ashes, and silence, and so he pretended. He wore the purple robes. He held court in palaces with missing roofs. He summoned envoys to crumbling halls. The empire he ruled was a ghost. Rule 36. If the body is gone, feed the shadow. Michael knew the empire could not expand, so he tried to outlast everyone else. He played the Pope against the kings of Europe. He sent letters, gifts, flattery. But behind the embroidered letters and golden seals, there was nothing. The cities were poor. The army was few. The provinces whispered of independence. Still, Byzantium limped forward, draped in borrowed glory, the rule of ritual, the last emperors. By the 14th century, the emperors were no longer rulers in the traditional sense. They were symbols, living relics, carried forward by ritual alone. Take John VIII of Palaiologos. He traveled to Florence in 1438 to negotiate with the Pope for military aid. The deal, reunion with the Catholic Church in exchange for protection from the rising Ottoman threat. John agreed, he bowed, he signed, and his people revolted not because of the politics, but because they felt their emperor had bowed to a Latin. Rule 37. When the crown bows, the empire breaks. When John returned to Constantinople, he had gained nothing but enemies. And yet he continued, parades, rituals, elaborate ceremonies, while the city withered. By then, Constantinople was no longer the heart of an empire. It was a single, half-abandoned city ringed by enemy lands. The final rule, Constantine the Fiendly and the end in 1453, the final chapter was written by Constantine the Fiendly Palaiologos. He had no illusions. The Ottomans surrounded the city with 80,000 troops and massive cannons. Constantinople had 7,000 defenders. No hope, no escape. And yet Constantine did not flee. He stood on the walls. He fought with his soldiers. He died with his city. Rule 38. If the empire must fall, let it fall with its name on your lips and steel in your hand. The Ottomans stormed the city. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. The streets ran red, but no one found Constantine's body. Some say he vanished. Others say he was buried in rubble. A few claim he became marble, to return when Constantinople is free again. But the truth is simple. Rome ended, not with a Caesar, but with a man who refused to let go of a dead idea. A closing whisper. The twisted rules of ancient Roman emperors were not rules at all. They were adaptations, masks, illusions. Each emperor carved new paths through old traditions, hoping that by bending the past, they could shape the future. But Rome, whether on the Palatine Hill or along the Bosporus, was never built to last forever. It was built to endure, until belief ran dry. The emperors wore purple. The people chanted their names. The gold coins bore their faces. But in the end, what remained? A few ruined walls, a cracked dome, a name whispered in ruins, and the echo of rules written in blood, silence, and ambition. By the seventh stretch of this labyrinthine story, the rules had become ghosts themselves, hovering over crumbling marble, flickering between columns like incense smoke. The men who now called themselves emperors were as much stage actors as sovereigns. Their reigns were filled with ceremony but hollowed of power. Each dawn over Constantinople rose on tradition rather than strength, faith rather than armies, memory rather than wealth. And yet even then, they obeyed the twisted rules, not written in law but in fear, vanity, and inherited illusions. The rule of shadows, civil wars. That no one won one of the most disturbing legacies of Roman imperial rule was its addiction to civil war. In earlier centuries, civil wars had at least been fought over genuine power, legions clashing over who held the purple. But by the 1300s and 1400s, the civil wars were fights for shadows. A clear example was the war between Andronikos II and his grandson Andronikos III. The elder ruled a weakened empire. The younger believed he could do better. And so the Byzantines went to war with themselves, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Entire provinces were burned. The military was hollowed out. Enemies outside the empire quietly smiled as cities were ransacked by fellow Greeks. Rule 39. If your enemy is family, your ruin will be blood and mirrors. Andronikos II eventually abdicated, defeated by his own grandson. But the empire lost more than just a ruler. It lost time. It lost soldiers. It lost trust. From then on, every faction looked inward first, for betrayal before looking outward for threat. The rule of monks and eunuchs as emperors lost real control over armies and land. They turned increasingly to palace figures, men who had no base of power except the emperor's favor. Eunuchs, monks, chamberlains. Some of the most powerful figures in the last century of Byzantium were men who had never commanded troops or governed provinces, but who controlled the flow of information within the palace. Rule 40. If you cannot control the legions, control the curtains. Eunuchs, unable to found dynasties of their own, became ideal power brokers. Their loyalty was to the throne alone, or so the emperors believed, but history shows otherwise. Eunuchs plotted, poisoned, whispered, and reshaped policy in the emperor's ear. They had no armies. They needed none. Their power lay in silence and proximity. And monks? Many emperors retired into monasteries, often after being deposed. Others sent their rivals into forced monastic life as a form of living execution. In a world ruled by divine right, to strip a man of the right to rule by making him a monk was a punishment worse than death. Rule 41. Silence can dethrone where swords fail. The rule of the Church: ally, enemy, and mirror. From the moment Constantine the Great baptized the empire into Christianity, the emperor was not just a man, he was God's chosen representative on earth, at least in theory. In practice, the Church became both shield and dagger. At times, emperors leaned on religious authority to justify cruelty. Other times, patriarchs rebelled against imperial demands. Take Emperor Michael Cerularius in the 11th century. He clashed with the Pope in Rome over ritual differences. Bread, language, liturgy. The details were minor. The consequences were vast. In 1054, the Great Schism split the Christian world in two: Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism. Michael didn't just break with the West. He changed the empire's soul. Rule 42. He who controls the cross controls the crown, yet emperors could just as easily fall victim to that same power. When rulers were excommunicated, their subjects often rebelled, believing God himself had abandoned the purple. It was a dangerous game the Church could bless, but it could also bind. And behind every incense cloud lay a noose, the rule of pretending to be Rome. By the end, the most twisted rule of all was this: to pretend they were still Roman. The emperors of Byzantium still called themselves Emperor of the Romans. They still performed coronations in Hagia Sophia. They still minted coins with Latin script even when the people no longer spoke it. But they no longer controlled Italy. They no longer controlled Egypt. They no longer even controlled Greece, and yet they clung to the illusion. Foreign kings, Franks, Germans, Slavs, created their own claims to Rome. They called themselves Holy Roman Emperors, or Kings, of Rome. And the Byzantines scoffed. They believed they were still the true Romans. Rule 43. A lie repeated long enough becomes a kingdom. This rule was not just delusion, it was necessity. For if they were not Rome, then what were they? A Greek-speaking court trapped in a dying city. A cult of rituals surrounded by enemies. To admit they were no longer Rome was to admit that everything had ended long ago, and so they wore the mask until the mask wore them. The rule of gold that did not exist as the empire shrank. Emperors became experts in financial illusion. There was no gold, but they printed coins anyway. There were no armies, but they handed out titles to foreign mercenaries. One such mercenary was Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese commander hired to help defend Constantinople in 1453. He came with a few hundred men and promises of more. Emperor Constantine V welcomed him with open arms. He had no choice. Rule 44. When you cannot feed an army, feed an ego. Titles. Land grants, honors. These were the coins of a bankrupt throne. The city's last budget could barely feed its own garrison. The empire had no navy. And yet Constantine continued to issue gold seals, sign ornate decrees, and receive envoys as if he ruled a continent. It wasn't deception. It was habit. It was ritual. It was Rome's final performance. The rule of death. With eyes open, when the Ottomans came, they did not come in disguise. They brought cannons the size of houses. They brought armies from across Anatolia. They built walls around the city itself. Constantine V's Palaiologos knew what was coming, but he did not flee. He held mass the night before the final battle. He stripped off his imperial robes. He kissed the icons. Then he took up his sword and fought beside common soldiers. He died in the chaos of battle. His body was never found. Rule 45. Let the final rule be written in silence. With Constantine's death, the Roman Empire, east and west, came to a final, definitive end. It did not go quietly. It did not go cleanly, but it went nobly. And in the silence that followed, the twisted rules that had governed emperors for over 1,000 years faded like smoke from a quenched candle. Whispers that remained. The world moved on. The Ottomans ruled. The city, now called Istanbul. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The purple robes were never worn again. And yet even now the myths of the emperors remain. We speak of Rome as if it never died. We whisper of emperors as if they might return. We admire their coins, their statues, their laws, ignoring the poison that often flowed beneath them, because we need stories. And the emperors of Rome, especially the twisted ones, were the greatest story of all. They were men who pretended to be gods, gods who died like men, and rulers who followed rules no one ever wrote down. But we remember them not for their victories, but for the strange, relentless ways they clung to power when all else had slipped away, not with grace, not with mercy, but with twisted brilliance. And that, perhaps, is the most Roman rule of all. By now we are in the slow-burning twilight of the Roman idea, where power moved not in triumphs but in corridors, beneath painted ceilings and between walls lined with shadows. Every word spoken was a calculation, every silence a threat. And yet even in this age of echoing emptiness, the rules still governed, or rather the memory of the rules. Like old ghosts still sitting on the throne, they whispered twisted laws into the ears of men already halfway broken by the burden of the crown. This part of the story is no longer about conquest. It is about survival, not of a people, but of an illusion. The illusion that Rome, even in its last brittle decades, could still command the world, or at least command itself. But Rome was no longer one thing. It was many. It was a mosaic of contradictions held together by nothing but stubborn faith and the emperors. They were no longer masters of fate, but janitors of destiny, sweeping up after a greatness that had long since left the room. Let's walk now into the final century, the century where Rome became a flicker, a century where emperors no longer made history, they only reacted to it, the rule of names that meant nothing. In the old days, a Roman emperor's name held weight like a pillar. Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius. A name could calm cities or stir legions. It stood for might, for order, for divine favor. But in the dying light of Byzantium, names were illusions. Take the Palaiologos dynasty, the last great house to sit the imperial throne. Its members all bore ancient, storied names: Manuel, John, Constantine. Names that once commanded awe now echoed hollow through courtyards full of unpaid guards and cracked statues. Rule 46. A name is only sacred when it is feared. These emperors clung to ritual. Their names appeared in gold-leafed documents. Their seals still carried the double-headed eagle, but power had shifted. No one trembled when a Palaiologos spoke. Their authority came not from strength but from memory, and memory is weak currency in a world that eats. The people no longer looked to the emperor for bread or defense. They looked to local warlords, or the church, or the markets. But still the emperors paraded, still they wore the purple, still they signed decrees over lands they hadn't seen in decades. The rule of ceremony. Over substance, the empire had become so ceremonial that emperors often spent more time preparing for processions than preparing for war. The coronation of an emperor could take days, processions through the streets, robes changed multiple times, rituals enacted that dated back to Constantine the Great. It didn't matter that the streets were falling apart, or that half the citizens watching were starving. The emperor must appear imperial. Rule 47. If you cannot be mighty, be magnificent. John the Hieth, for instance, was paraded before the Western powers like a glittering ghost. When he went to Florence to negotiate religious union with the Catholic Church, he brought an enormous entourage: priests, scholars, relics, golden robes. But the Pope saw through it. He saw a man wrapped in pageantry, but stripped of real leverage. John signed the union anyway, hoping for Western help. What he got was betrayal at home. The Orthodox Church called him a traitor. His people rioted. No Western aid came, and when John died, he left no heir. Just debts and despair. Ceremony had not saved him, only delayed the rot, the rule of borrowed power. With no legions, no gold, and few cities, the late emperors turned to what little remained: foreign favor. They married off sisters and daughters to Serbian kings, Bulgarian warlords, and Genoese merchants. They promised trade deals, relics, honorary titles. They turned emperorship into a form of diplomatic theater: less ruler, more supplicant. Rule 48. When you can no longer rule with iron, rule with honey. Constantine the Fiend's own family was full of such deals. His brothers governed despotates, semi-independent provinces like Morea, modern-day Peloponnese, cutting their own pacts with neighboring powers. One brother was even offered a crown by the Ottomans to rule under their shadow. He accepted, then was betrayed. By then, the empire had become a puzzle of competing loyalties. Everyone wore the Roman title, but no one served the empire. Even the Ottomans used Roman imagery when it suited them. The title Caesar of the Romans was eventually claimed by the Sultan himself, Mehmed II, after Constantinople fell. Why? Because the title still had symbolic weight. Even the enemy understood. To hold that name was to hold the soul of the old world. The rule of inheritance by collapsed succession in late Byzantium was not marked by firm laws or smooth transitions. Ideal was chaos. The throne passed through brothers, cousins, nephews, not because they were suited, but because they were available. Manuel II, the father of Constantine V, had many sons. Some took holy vows, others governed small cities. One tried to become emperor and failed. Constantine eventually took the throne, not because he was the best, but because he was the last. Rule 49. When no one wants the crown, it will. Find the man with nothing left to lose. Constantine V inherited not a realm, but a ruin. A city with 2 functioning gates, a harbor blocked by chains, a treasury empty save for relics. And still he acted the part. He repaired walls. He negotiated with Genoa and Venice. He sent letters begging for ships, men, hope. But hope was not for sale in the 1450s. The Ottoman Empire had grown vast. Its cannons were new, its soldiers fresh, its will unstoppable. The rule of standing. When all fall in April of 1453, the siege began. By May, the walls shook. By June, the city cracked. Constantine knew what was coming. He held final mass in Hagia Sophia. He kissed the altar. He asked forgiveness from his people. Then he put on his armor and walked to the walls. There, under a storm of fire and steel, he vanished. Rule 50. The last rule is written in silence. No one ever saw Constantine again. Some say he was buried in rubble, others that he disguised himself and escaped. A few claim he became marble, waiting to return. But the empire? It did not wait. It ended in fire, in screams, in the sound of bells torn from towers. The Ottomans entered the city. They crowned themselves new lords, and the Roman story ended, not with a final chapter, but with the closing of a book no one could read anymore. The whisper that outlived the empire, and yet, even now the twisted rules survive. You see them in the titles of kings, in the domes of churches, in the black eagles of eastern flags, in marble thrones long empty. We still speak of Rome. We still learn its laws. We still imagine its emperors as something more than men, because their rules, twisted as they were, spoke to the most human of all desires, to last, to matter, to shape the world even when it no longer wants to be shaped. And that is why the emperors, in their madness and splendor, still haunt us. They were not wise, they were not kind, but they were real as fear, as real as ambition, as real as the sound of sandals on stone in a palace now drowned by time. And so the twisted rules remain, not in law but in legend, not in stone but in silence, not in Rome but in us. There is a strange echo that clings to the legacy of the Roman emperors. It is not the echo of military parades or civic triumphs. It is quieter than that. It is the echo of contradiction, where power and helplessness, divinity and depravity, glory and disgrace walk side by side. And as we drift further into the late empire, long past Augustus and well into the cold mosaic halls of Constantinople, those contradictions become rules in themselves, twisted, tangled, but deeply human. Now, we leave behind the formal corridors of the palaces and step into the quiet rooms where history is not written, but whispered, where the emperors begin to resemble not gods nor even kings, but haunted figures, cloaked in ceremony, yet hollowed by the weight of centuries. This is where we find the final rules, the ones written not on parchment or stone, but on the face of the last men to wear the crown. The rule of appearances over reality. The Byzantine Empire stumbled toward its end. A strange transformation took place. The throne remained golden, the imperial robes remained purple, and the double-headed eagle still flew. But the empire itself had become a mask. The rituals of power continued as if nothing had changed, even while the walls cracked and the treasury emptied. Rule 51. If you cannot save the empire, at least look like you are trying. This rule explains why emperors still walked in sacred processions with relics, even as the city starved. It explains why the imperial court still met in its ancient halls, lit by flickering torches, even as ambassadors were greeted with borrowed robes and fake jewels. The illusion of power became the only power left. Constantine the Phinkas Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, inherited this broken masquerade. When the Ottomans approached Constantinople, he did not flee. Instead, he continued to hold council. He hosted diplomatic meetings. He ordered defenses repaired, despite having no money, no army, and no allies. He knew the performance mattered, if only to the few thousand souls who still believed Rome lived. The power of appearances was the final comfort Rome had to offer. The empire would die clothed in silk, not rags. The rule of sacred theatre. One of the most twisted legacies of Roman rule was its obsession with theatre, not in the literal sense of stage plays, but in the ceremonial performance of power. Over the centuries, this evolved into an intricate tapestry of gestures, processions, and speeches, where the emperor played a part that no longer matched his authority. By the 15th century, an emperor's arrival in church was choreographed down to the angle of his bow. His prayers were whispered in Greek even when few understood them. His meal was brought by servants dressed as ancient soldiers. Everything was ritual. Rule 52. When the empire fades, make the memory of it beautiful. Visitors from the West often remarked on this odd devotion to ritual. They found the Byzantine court overly rigid, even bizarre. Ambassadors were kept waiting for hours, not out of malice but to preserve hierarchy. Gifts were exchanged with formulaic precision. The emperor's smile when it came was calculated, and yet these rituals served a purpose. They sustained a sense of continuity, a line traced back to Constantine the Great. Even as the empire shrank to a few crumbling neighborhoods, it felt eternal. This sacred theater reached its haunting crescendo during the final Mass in Hagia Sophia in 1453. As Ottoman cannons pounded the walls, the emperor and his people gathered beneath the great dome. Candles flickered, priests chanted in old tongues. The choir sang hymns whose notes had not changed in 1,000 years. The world outside was ending, but inside the script still held. The rule of the useless heir. Throughout Rome's history, succession had always been a danger, whether by bloodline, adoption, or violence. The question of who rules next was rarely simple. In the twilight of the empire, it became even more tragic. Rule 53. The most dangerous thing to inherit is an illusion of power. In earlier centuries, emperors named successors to maintain stability. Sometimes it worked, like Marcus Aurelius passing the throne to Commodus, though that turned out poorly. Sometimes it didn't, like the year of the 5 emperors, when claimants rose and fell like dust. But in the last days, there were often no heirs at all. No sons, no nephews, no generals capable of ruling. The imperial line collapsed under its own weight, not through murder or civil war, but through apathy. Who wanted to inherit a collapsing city? Who would wear the purple only to starve, to beg, to be blamed? By the time Constantine V took the throne, he was not the best choice. He was merely the only one left willing to stand. He did not crown a successor. He had no son. No heir ever sat the throne after him. The line ended with a whisper, not a coronation, the rule of false hope. There were many moments in the final years of Byzantium when it seemed the empire might be saved. Western aid was promised. Mercenaries were hired. Ships appeared on the horizon. Even as late as April 1453, Constantine V still sent envoys to plead for help from Venice and Genoa. But help never came, or when it did, it was too little, too late. Rule 54. In the absence of victory, trade in hope. Hope became a currency. Emperors gave speeches not to inspire real action, but to delay collapse. They told their people that angels would fight beside them, that the Virgin Mary would shield the city, that Rome had survived worse. And the people, desperate and cold, believed. Even the emperor may have believed, or perhaps he simply acted as if he did, knowing belief was the only thing left. When the final assault began, hope vanished in an instant. The walls fell. The chains across the harbor broke. The enemy flooded in, and the empire, for all its rituals and prayers, was devoured. Hope had been a beautiful lie, but it had kept them warm until the end. The rule of dignified collapse. In many ways, the final and most twisted rule of all was this. Rule 55. If you must fall, fall with your face toward the enemy. The last emperor of Rome did not run. He did not beg. He did not hide behind others. He donned his armor, he climbed the ramparts, and when the final gate broke, he charged into the melee. No body was ever found. No one saw him fall. Only silence remained. And in that silence, a rule. So old and so simple, it did not need to be written. Die standing. It was not a Roman rule. It was not a Byzantine rule. It was simply human. A final act of defiance in a world that had already moved on. The empire that refused to die, and so the Roman Empire ended. Or did it? Because if you look closely, you'll see it never truly left. Its symbols still endure. Its laws still shape our courts. Its ideas still echo in books, buildings, and ceremonies. Even the word emperor did not vanish. It was picked up by the Ottomans, by the Holy Roman Empire, by Napoleon. Every time a tyrant wrapped himself in grandeur, every time a ruler built a city of stone and called it eternal, the ghost of Rome smiled. Because the final twisted rule is this, Rule 56. A dead empire can outlive a living one, if its story is too beautiful to forget. History often ends stories with a clean line. An emperor dies, a city falls, an empire collapses. But the truth is never clean. In the long, slow fade of the Roman world, there was no final curtain, no clear break between what was Roman and what came after. Instead, there was twilight. A twilight filled with strange rulers, conflicting laws, phantom kingdoms, and a desperate attempt to preserve meaning in an increasingly meaningless world. This was not just the end of an empire. It was the birth of myths, and those myths would go on to form a new kind of twisted rulebook, one not for emperors of flesh and blood, but for emperors of memory. False heirs, pretenders, shadow rulers, men who clung to the Roman name long after Rome was dust. Let's open that last chapter, the chapter of what came after the end, the rule of the Ghost Empire. Once Constantinople fell, one might imagine the world moved on, but it didn't, not entirely. Rule 57. Even dead empires cast shadows. Throughout Eastern Europe and beyond, the idea of the Roman emperor lingered. The Orthodox Church did not simply dissolve. Many of its leaders fled to Russia, and with them came the notion that Moscow was the third Rome. The first Rome had fallen to heresy and division. The second, Constantinople, had been taken by the infidel. But Moscow was pure. Moscow would endure. This belief wasn't just religious, it was political. Russian czars began to refer to themselves as Caesars. The word itself, czar, is a derivative of Caesar. And with it came imperial rituals, court hierarchies, and even dreams of universal rule. Was it real? Not in the Roman sense. But the idea of the empire had survived its own death, and that idea proved more powerful than any sword. Rome's ghost had found a new body. The rule of the usurping West, meanwhile, in the Latin West, another kind of fiction took root. The Holy Roman Empire, forged by Charlemagne and sanctified by the Pope, claimed descent from ancient Rome. This was not just arrogance, it was necessity. Rule 58. If no one can prove you're not the emperor, act like you are. The Holy Roman emperors wore robes modeled after Roman togas. They issued decrees in Latin. They revived titles like consul and senator in name, if not in function, but theirs was an empire in name only. A loose confederation of German principalities, squabbling duchies and half-loyal bishops. It was said, the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, yet it endured. For nearly 1,000 years, on parchment, in ceremony, in the imagination of kings. The power of Rome was not in its armies anymore, it was in its story. And stories are much harder to kill. The rule of the dignified lie, the final centuries of Roman identity were soaked in contradictions. Flags still bore eagles, coins still bore Latin mottos, but the people who carried them no longer knew why. Rule 59. When you've inherited a throne built on illusion, polish the illusion until it shines. By the 18th century, some monarchs in Europe still claimed to rule in the tradition of Rome. Even Napoleon, who had overthrown the last Holy Roman Emperor, crowned himself while invoking Caesar and Augustus. He surrounded himself with imperial imagery, laurel crowns, Roman-style architecture, triumphal processions. He commissioned medals showing him in profile like a Roman coin. He declared a senate, though it had no power. It was theatre. Elaborate, convincing, seductive theatre. But it worked, because human beings long for continuity, for meaning, for the idea that the old world still lives on in some way. The Roman Empire had ended, but the myth of it had become immortal. The rule of eternal Rome even today, the phrase Roman Empire holds strange weight. Political theorists speak of Pax Romana. Architects still reference Roman columns. The laws of ancient jurists are taught in modern law schools. Our calendars, languages, even alphabets bear its fingerprints. Rule 60. If you build your empire deep enough into the bones of civilization, it will never die. In the year 2025, somewhere in Europe, a child will study Latin. Another will walk through a courthouse built to resemble a Roman basilica. A tourist will gaze at the ruins of a Roman bathhouse and whisper, "Imagine what this used to be." They won't remember every emperor, but they will remember the idea. And that idea, stripped of its cruelty, cleaned of its blood, is what survives. The rule of remembered cruelty, and yet memory is not always kind. Modern historians remember the emperors for their madness as much as for their might. Nero fiddling as Rome burned, Caligula declaring war on the sea, Commodus dressing as Hercules, Domitian walking through palace halls muttering, "Kill me before I kill you." Rule 61. The further you are from power, the more twisted the tales become. It is easier to believe that emperors were madmen than to accept the complex web of real politics, real pain, real fear. It is easier to call them tyrants than to imagine what it means to hold the fate of millions in your hands. So the legends grow sharper, bloodier, funnier. We remember Tiberius as a pervert. We remember Elagabalus as a cross-dressing chaos god. We remember Nero as the fiddler, though fiddles didn't exist, because it makes the past manageable, entertaining. But beneath the jokes lies a sobering truth. Power, unchecked, always warps. Whether in Rome, Byzantium, Moscow, Berlin, or today, the rule of the eternal cautionary tale Rome is not a blueprint. It is a warning. Rule 62. To rule like a Roman is to walk a blade so thin it cuts the soul. The emperors of Rome lived. In luxury, yes, but they also lived in fear. No sleep was truly restful, no advisor fully trusted, no day without calculation. Some ruled well: Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. But even they fell to the weight of succession, revolt, plague, and the limits of control. The legacy of Roman emperors is not just opulence, it is loneliness, it is paranoia, it is blood spilled beneath marble statues and names carved in stone, only to be scratched away by the next ruler. We tell these stories to remember what power can do to others and to the one who holds it, the final rule. So what is the last twisted rule of Roman emperors? Is it about control, legacy, Madness, no, it is about silence. Rule 63. In the end, every emperor becomes a statue, and every statue waits to be toppled. Look around any former imperial city and you'll see them. Ruined arches, broken pedestals, worn stone faces half covered in ivy. Some are forgotten, some are venerated, most are misunderstood. They do not speak, but if they could, they might not boast. They might simply sigh, because power, however vast, ends, sometimes in fire, sometimes in betrayal, sometimes in dust, but always, always in silence. In the stillness of early morning, just beyond the reach of the olive groves, there once stood a quiet marble monument. No inscription remained, just a half-cracked foot, carved perfectly, delicately, in the shape of an emperor's sandal. That was all that was left of a man who ruled over millions, because even the mightiest footsteps are swallowed by time. But Rome did not end all at once. It faded, and in that fading, a new breed of ruler emerged. No longer merely emperors by blood, conquest or divine favor, these men began to wield power by narrative, by illusion, by bending the laws not only of the state, but of history itself. Let us now walk deeper into the most twisted rules of those final emperors who ruled more with symbols than swords, yet managed to maintain an empire that was little more than a shell filled with ceremony and shadows. The rule of imagined law. When Rome became too vast to govern from a single point, emperors began to fracture power. There was East and West, Augustus and Caesar, usurper and co-ruler. But all this division created opportunity for lies, for manipulation, for those who understood that legal ambiguity was more useful than clarity. Rule 64. When the law becomes impossible to follow, the emperor becomes the law. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, Roman emperors were not so much lawmakers as living exceptions to their own rules. No general could be charged with treason for failing to deliver taxes on time, while another was praised for burning half a province in the name of imperial security. Laws were rewritten not to clarify, but to justify, and every clarification brought new contradictions. The Codex Theodosianus, for instance, tried to compile all the laws of the empire into a single document, but it included laws that directly contradicted each other, one granting religious tolerance, another condemning pagans to death. This wasn't incompetence, it was design. If the emperor's word today could cancel yesterday's law, then his power was not legal, it was total. The rule of ritual over reality power by this point was not rooted in armies alone, it was performed. Every gesture, every title, every entrance into a city was part of a script, a sacred play. Rule 65. Reality bends to ritual when the audience knows the ending. A triumphal entry into Rome might include a golden chariot, flower petals thrown by slaves, cheering crowds carefully placed in specific sections of the street. The emperor would pretend to be surprised. The senators would pretend to cheer without fear. No one believed it, but they needed it. Ritual created predictability. And in a world slipping into chaos, barbarian invasions, famine, religious upheaval, predictability felt like safety, so emperors became actors. Theatrical gods draped in purple, appearing at precise moments, reciting carefully crafted decrees and vanishing again behind velvet curtains. It didn't matter whether they ruled in truth, they ruled in symbol, the rule of glorified madness. We often wonder, were the worst Roman emperors truly mad? Or were they simply playing roles that the empire needed them to play? Nero's singing competitions, Elagabalus marrying a sun god, Commodus fighting in the arena, these seemed like signs of delusion, but perhaps they were signs of strategy. Rule 66. The emperor who controls the narrative controls the madness. By appearing unhinged, emperors inspired both fear and fascination. The people could gossip, speculate, even mock, so long as they never stopped watching. Madness gave the illusion of unpredictability, and unpredictability discouraged plots. If the emperor might execute his own guard on a whim, who would dare conspire? More than once, emperors deliberately leaked rumors of their own insanity to silence their enemies. It was easier to laugh at a madman than to challenge him. It's possible that some emperors became mad, but many others learned to weaponize the appearance of madness as a shield. The rule of the unseen ruler. As the empire aged, a strange thing happened. The emperors began to disappear, not physically, but from the streets. Gone were the days of Augustus, walking the roads of Rome in plain toga. By the time of Diocletian, emperors were no longer seen as first among equals, but as gods on earth, remote, cloaked, distant. Rule 67. The emperor who is never seen becomes whatever the people need him to be. Emperors began living inside elaborate palaces, massive complexes that resembled temples more than homes. Audience halls were designed to make a single man appear vast and unreachable. Petitions were answered with scrolls. Faces were obscured by veils. Even voices were mediated by intermediaries. The people no longer knew their emperor. They imagined him. And in that imagination he could be terrible, divine, merciful, wrathful, anything at all, because no one could say otherwise. The rule of memory as empire. When the West fell and the Eastern Roman Empire lived on in Byzantium, a new twist emerged: the conquest of memory. If you could no longer conquer territory, you could conquer history. Rule 68. Rewrite the past and you inherit its authority. Byzantine emperors began editing Roman history. They emphasized their connection to Constantine, not Nero. They portrayed themselves as spiritual successors, not military tyrants. Old pagan emperors were vilified. Christian ones were glorified, even if their actual lives were filled with bloodshed. Coinage was restamped, temples were rededicated, statues were recarved. The past itself became a battlefield. This was not just historical revisionism, it was a means of power. Because if you could convince the people that the empire had always led to you, then you were not a ruler, you were destiny, the rule of sacred bureaucracy. In the later empire, especially under the Byzantines, power became deeply bureaucratic. No longer just swords and coins, but paper and titles. Rule 69. Build a system so complex only you can navigate it. Byzantine court titles reached absurd levels. There were the protovestiarios, keeper of the emperor's wardrobe; the parakoimomenos, the one who sleeps near the emperor; the chartularios tou kanikleou, keeper of the imperial inkpot. Each role came with robes, rituals, and rivalries. This web of roles served a purpose. It made the emperor indispensable, because no one else could untangle the chaos he had created. And while officials competed over protocol and parchment, the emperor stood above them all, untouched. It was administration as a weapon, obscurity as a tool, the rule of the inevitable collapse. No empire lasts forever, not even one that rewrites the rules. And the end, though long and slow, did come. The Ottomans breached the walls of Constantinople in 1453. The last emperor, Constantine, is said to have thrown off his imperial garments and charged into the fray with his soldiers, vanishing beneath the bodies of the fallen. Rule 70. Even the most twisted rule ends with a sword or silence, and yet even now tourists walk through Istanbul and whisper about Roman ruins. Historians still debate whether Byzantium was the real Roman Empire. Politicians invoke the Pax Romana. Churches name themselves after Roman saints. The empire may be dead, but the rules it invented, rules of power, illusion, ritual, madness, memory, and myth, still echo, not just in history books, but in every government palace, in every grand staircase, in every time someone says, "This is how it's always been." Beyond the ruins and beneath the cracked marble of crumbled forums, there lingers something that cannot be measured in coins, legions, or lost provinces. It is the residue of power that rewrote not only borders, but human behavior itself, for Rome, and especially the long shadow of its emperors, did not fall quietly. Their rules, twisted, theatrical, and terrifying, slithered into the fabric of governance, faith, justice, and even the private thoughts of rulers for generations to come, and so we continue. Not into the glory days of Augustus or the terror of Nero, but deeper into the creeping rules that distorted reality across centuries. These were not edicts passed in daylight, but mechanisms of control whispered in halls of incense and paranoia. Let us examine the next grotesque refinements of imperial rule, the rule of ceremonial paralysis. At a glance, the ceremonies of the late empire appear noble: grand receptions, incense-thick coronations, public blessings, and sacred feasts. But beneath their gold leaf and lit candles was a chilling truth. Rule 71. When ritual consumes reason, power becomes theater, and governance rots beneath the costume. The emperors of Byzantium were entombed in procedure. Every motion, how to sit, when to stand, who could touch the imperial sleeve, was codified. Court manuals, such as the Book of Ceremonies by Emperor Constantine VII, detailed every single movement expected of the emperor in every possible scenario, down to how far incense bearers should stand from his throne. In theory, this created order. In practice, it created paralysis. An emperor could not act without setting a precedent. A gesture of mercy could disrupt the court hierarchy. A minor breach in timing, a door opened too early, a nod given to the wrong noble, could spiral into accusations of sacrilege or treason, and so emperors began to fear action. The sacredness of their image meant they were imprisoned within it. It was no longer enough to rule wisely. One had to perform divinity perfectly. The imperial court became a stage, and the emperor a trembling actor, watched by thousands, yet utterly alone. The rule of political martyrdom. In a world where betrayal was as common as bread, a new kind of weapon emerged: the noble fall. Rule 72. To appear betrayed is to claim moral victory, even in political death. As Rome entered its declining centuries, emperors and pretenders alike learned that losing well was sometimes more powerful than winning. A deposed emperor might be paraded through the streets, mocked and exiled, but if he wept publicly, praised the gods, forgave his enemies, and embraced his fate, he became something else: a martyr. Crowds remembered the spectacle, historians wrote it down, and generations later such figures were used as examples of true Roman virtue. This tactic was not limited to those who genuinely lost. Some emperors staged their own downfalls. Abdications, fake assassinations, and vanishing acts were used to escape blame for failed wars or internal chaos. Better to disappear with dignity than be dragged through the mud, and in the vacuum, their successors often stumbled. And the people, disillusioned, remembered the honorable man who walked away. Thus defeat became legacy, the rule of glorious suffering. In the early empire, an emperor was expected to be strong, radiant, and divine. But centuries later, another archetype emerged, one even more twisted. Rule 73. The suffering emperor is more sacred than the invincible one. Christianity transformed the empire not only in religion, but in politics. Pain was no longer shameful, it was sanctified, and emperors began to embrace suffering. Heraclius, the emperor who reclaimed the true cross from the Persians, marched on foot barefoot, weeping with the relic in his arms. Later accounts praised him not for conquest, but for his penance. Other emperors followed suit. Public fasts, self-flagellation, public prayers kneeling on stone. These were not private devotions, they were performances of holy endurance. The image of the emperor changed. He no longer stood above pain, he bore it for the people. This made rebellion harder. For who could raise a sword against a ruler who mimicked Christ himself? Pain became a shield. Humiliation became a halo, and so emperors cloaked tyranny in tears, the rule of divine madness. Reborn as emperors took on religious roles. Their proximity to the divine took darker turns. Some began claiming direct communication with saints, angels, or even Christ. Rule 74. When no mortal may challenge the emperor, only heaven can correct him, and heaven rarely speaks. Emperors were now not merely chosen by God, but in communion with him. Constantine saw a vision of the cross before battle. Later, emperors claimed dreams, omens, and voices, but soon divine visions were used to justify every act. God told me to raise taxes. An angel commanded the war. The Virgin wept until we burned the heretics. It became difficult to separate madness from policy. And again, this madness, real or staged, served a purpose. Those who challenged the emperor risked challenging heaven itself. Even bishops hesitated, and thus power could hide behind sanctity. And act without restraint. The rule of the vanishing past as new emperors rose in troubled times. A cruel tactic emerged, the erasure of one's predecessor. Rule 75. To rule completely, remove the memory of the one who ruled before you. This was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Statues were shattered, names chiseled off inscriptions, coins were melted, histories were rewritten. To the common people, it was as if the previous emperor had never lived. But in truth, this erasure did not remove the past, it twisted it. People remembered not the actual deeds of the condemned emperor, but the act of erasing them. Rumors bloomed in the silence. Was he truly a villain or a threat? In this way, emperors became ghosts who haunted the throne. And current, rulers often governed in fear of being next. Control over history became more valuable than control over armies. The rule of silence, not every rule was loud. In fact, the most terrifying one was silence. Rule 76. The emperor who says nothing cannot be accused of lies. Some of the most effective late emperors spoke rarely, if at all. They let ministers announce decrees. They allowed generals to speak of strategy. They observed, watched, and intervened only when absolutely necessary, and this silence created mystery. Was the emperor wise or plotting? Was he sick or thinking? Was he absent or everywhere? In a world where words were so often twisted, the refusal to speak became an act of supreme power, because nothing is more feared than what you cannot predict, the rule of the eternal city. Even as the Western Empire crumbled and Eastern rulers Watch their borders shrink. One lie held firm. Rome still reigns. Rule 77. If the city falls, build it in your mind and make the world kneel to it. Constantinople claimed Rome's legacy. So did the Pope. So did the German emperors centuries later. Even Napoleon tried to crown himself with Roman titles. The twisted rule of the emperors was this: they convinced the world that Rome could never die, only transform, and so it did. Into churches, into kingdoms, into law, into language. Rome became not a place but a concept, a myth that every powerful man wanted to wear like armor, because Rome's greatest invention was not roads or legions or aqueducts. It was the idea that power could be eternal. And in that idea they wrote the final, most twisted rule of all. The empire was no longer an empire in truth, but a mirror house of symbols, shadows, and increasingly desperate rituals to maintain the illusion of control. As it aged, the rules of Rome's rulers became more perverse, more theatrical, and more detached from the lived experience of the people they ruled. And yet they endured, because these rules weren't just written in decrees or etched in marble. They were imprinted on human nature, on fear, ambition, envy, and the irresistible draw of power dressed in gold. Let us return now to those final, fading centuries where Roman emperors followed rules that were not just twisted, but irreversible. As the Roman Empire decayed in slow, tragic elegance, the rules governing imperial behavior became more rigid, yet more absurd. The very men meant to lead the world's greatest empire were bound by chains of superstition, paranoia, inherited cruelty, and theatrical customs that had outlived their meaning by centuries. The empire itself had become a kind of stage, grand, creaking and stained with the blood of its former glory. One of the most twisted expectations placed upon a Roman emperor by the 3rd and 4th centuries was this: he must be divine, but never too divine. Worshipped, but not so boldly that it threatened the older gods of Rome, nor the rising cults of Christianity. This balancing act created a rule of presence that was not just ceremonial, it was schizophrenic. In public, the emperor must appear as Jupiter's earthly reflection. In private, he must whisper prayers to a foreign Eastern sun god, or nervously consult Jewish astrologers for omens about his enemies. Emperors were now expected to reside in seclusion, not out of modesty, but because being seen too often diminished their mystery. This birthed a strange contradiction. The people must love the emperor and even die for him in battle, yet they must never lay eyes upon him unless he chose to emerge like a living statue. This distorted rule of appearance gave rise to the sacred curtain of the palace, a literal veil hung between the emperor and all but his most trusted advisors. Some emperors of the later empire, like Constantine and his successors, would only be seen on horseback from a distance, or while sitting on a raised golden throne surrounded by smoke and chanting. Court life changed accordingly. Officials would prostrate themselves, lying flat on their stomachs with arms outstretched before they were allowed to speak. To rise without permission could mean death. A subtle law, never written down but enforced without fail. And this sacred invisibility came at a cost, for by shielding themselves from public scrutiny, emperors also made it easier for their own guards, their own sons, their own wives to conspire in shadow. If one rule twisted power, another twisted trust. It became understood that emperors should never eat what had not been tasted by 3 different slaves first. Their chambers were checked hourly for knives, and the gardeners were required to clip roses with wooden shears. The rule of paranoia became not a caution, but a practice. If an emperor trusted more than 2 people for more than 1 month, it was seen as weakness, and the punishments for betrayal grew ever more theatrical. Skin flayed publicly, eyes removed, and then the victim paraded to remind others. Even poets who wrote verses deemed too metaphorical, suggesting perhaps the emperor was a falling sun, would be forced to eat their scrolls and then hurled from cliffs. But one of the most grotesque rules developed during the 4th century was that of the eternal procession. Any time an emperor returned to Rome, or later to Constantinople, he could not simply walk into the city. He must be paraded in full regalia, wearing robes so heavy they required hidden belts, standing motionless in a golden chariot, pulled not by horses, but by white-robed men dressed as gods. Alongside him marched prisoners, chained, who were sentenced to death after the parade, because their execution was considered part of the imperial celebration. It was a rule that revealed Rome's addiction to symbolic dominance. The emperor must arrive not as man, but as myth, and in doing so he himself became the most fragile part of the entire display. This addiction to symbolism crept into law itself. An emperor's edict could not be undone, not even by the emperor. So another rule emerged. When a mistake was made, a divine clarification would be issued. Never an admission of error. Instead, the emperor would receive a dream or a celestial sign that required a new interpretation. Lawyers and senators were then forced to pretend the earlier law had never been uttered. To even acknowledge the contradiction became treason. By the time of Emperor Valentinian, this legal delusion extended to death itself. If a nobleman was executed without a formal charge, his death could be reclassified as voluntary departure. His estate would remain intact, and his widow allowed to remarry without shame. A twisted rule of mercy that masked political murder. Even imperial illness became theatre. If an emperor fell sick, doctors would lie outright about the symptoms, because acknowledging a mortal weakness in a divine figure could cause riots. It became common for an emperor to be pronounced dead, embalmed, and buried before the public even knew he was ill, and the corpse could not simply disappear. It had to be seen, but not too closely. Often displayed under perfumed veils in incense-choked halls, the dead emperor's body would be paraded and cheered for days, then sealed in a tomb that was guarded not to protect it, but to prevent others from checking that he was, in fact, truly dead. Then came the most chilling rule of all, the rule of echoes. This law, deeply embedded in palace tradition but never written, stated that any emperor who came to power by blood must cleanse the court of echoes. This meant that anyone who had served the previous emperor, even loyally, might now be considered dangerous. A new emperor was expected to purge not just traitors, but witnesses, advisors, scribes, cooks, physicians, even musicians and servants. It was not personal, it was policy. An inherited cruelty disguised as prudence. Entire palace wings would be emptied, libraries burned, coins reminted. A new emperor meant a new god, and gods, unlike kings, must leave no room for memory. The empire's slow death was not only physical, it was narrative. The stories had to be rewritten, the monuments renamed, the triumphs declared retroactively by decree. In the end, the twisted rules of Rome's final emperors did not just distort leadership. They warped time itself. A man might be crowned emperor in March and erased by September. His statues melted, his name chiseled off walls, his birthday made illegal to celebrate. In his place would rise another god, another golden mask, another frightened man hidden behind a sacred curtain, and the people, they watched, they bowed, they cheered, because even in its madness, Rome had taught them this above all, that nothing was more dangerous than remembering too clearly. The laws of the emperors were not built to govern. They were built to outlast betrayal, to outlast death, and to be feared even in silence. And in silence, they endured. In the end, it wasn't the swords that kept emperors in power. Not truly. It was 1,000 invisible rules, twisted customs, inherited fears, ceremonial lies, and the deep, cultivated silence of an empire afraid of truth. As the sun set on the Roman Empire, both in the West and later in the East, the rule of the emperor became less about governance and more about survival. The twisted rules that had governed behavior for centuries no longer served the state. They served the mask, and the mask had grown heavier. By the 5th century, emperors no longer ruled Rome from Rome. The old capital had become too dangerous, too exposed. They ruled from Ravenna, from Milan, from Constantinople. They moved with entire mobile courts, like traveling circuses of gold and parchment, of paranoia and ritual. Each morning the emperor was dressed by no fewer than 12 attendants. Not out of luxury, but out of custom. Each layer of clothing represented a divine symbol. The purple cloak could not be fastened unless the emperor said the correct prayer. The golden diadem, symbol of his cosmic power, had to be kissed by 3 eunuchs before being placed on his head. These weren't fashion choices. These were shields against bad omens, and omens had become everything. There was by this time a rule known quietly as the rule of the chickens. Before any military campaign or decision of state, sacred chickens, yes, chickens, were fed in a specific courtyard. If they ate greedily, the decision was deemed blessed. If they did not, the meeting was postponed. Commanders would even lie about the chicken's appetite to avoid offending the gods. The empire had become a theater of signs. No emperor could act without first interpreting the stars, the clouds, the entrails of sheep, or the flight of birds. But if the signs were misread, the consequences could be catastrophic. Take Emperor Majorian, a relatively competent man who tried to restore some dignity to the collapsing Western Empire in the mid-5th century. He launched a campaign to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. But the sacred augurs warned against his voyage. Ships were destroyed. Advisors vanished. Within months, Majorian was betrayed and executed, not by an army, but by the rule that he had broken. Never challenge the signs. And then there was the rule of bloodline illusion. By the empire's final centuries, emperors were rarely born noble. They were soldiers, generals, even peasants elevated by politics or popularity. Yet each was expected to invent a divine or imperial ancestry. Coins were minted, showing them alongside long-dead Augusti. Statues were crafted depicting them as Jupiter reborn. It didn't matter if it was true. It mattered that it looked true. Truth had become the enemy of the imperial image. And so, new rules of forgetting were etched into policy. A disgraced emperor was not merely exiled. He was edited. Official scrolls would remove his name. His statues were melted. Even historians were instructed to replace or reshape his deeds. Some scholars who refused were imprisoned or vanished. The state rewrote its own past on command, each new ruler forging a reality where his enemies had never existed. In time, Rome had as many fake histories as it had gods, and perhaps the most perverse rule of all, the rule of deification. Even the most brutal emperors, those who had burned cities, executed their families and bankrupted the treasury, were often declared gods after death. This ritual was called apotheosis, and it involved a staged ascent into the heavens. In the Forum or Circus Maximus, an eagle would be released from a burning platform, symbolizing the emperor's soul rising to Olympus. Priests and senators would cry out in rehearsed voices that they had seen him enter the sky. Coins would be struck calling him Divus, the divine. It didn't matter who he had been in life. What mattered was what he became in death, another mask, another marble face among a pantheon of contradictions. Even emperors who died by assassination or madness were deified, if it served the politics of the living. Because once divine, they could not be questioned. Their laws could not be undone. Their enemies, even posthumously, could be punished for impiety. In this way, the dead ruled the living, not with wisdom, but with ritual. But by the 6th century, even these rituals began to fail. The Western Empire had fallen. The Eastern emperors in Constantinople, still calling themselves Basileus ton Romaion, Emperor of the Romans, carried on the traditions. But the mask cracked more each year. Justinian, one of the last emperors, to try reviving the glory of Rome, discovered that no matter how many churches he built, no matter how many laws he reformed, the twisted rules would outlive him. He spent his final years haunted by whispers, plagues, and rebellions. His own wife, Theodora, a former actress, wielded more power than half the Senate. Even she followed her own set of unwritten rules, rules of survival in a court where a misplaced word could end your bloodline. And so the empire limped forward, century after century, shrouded in incense, masked in gold, bleeding in silence. Its final emperors still marched through velvet-curtained halls, still touched their robes with trembling fingers, still whispered lies to priests, to generals, to scribes, and still dreamed that they were gods, but the people no longer believed. The rituals felt hollow, the crowds grew thinner, the statues crumbled, and when Mehmed II entered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire, he found a city steeped not just in history, but in illusion. A palace full of empty thrones, rusted swords, and laws no one dared enforce. The last emperor, Constantine XIII, vanished in the final siege. No golden chariot, no eagle sent skyward, no apotheosis, only silence and stone. The twisted rules that had governed emperors for over 1,000 years had died with him, not with a shout, but with a whispered prayer, buried beneath the rubble of a world too afraid to see itself. And perhaps that is the final twisted rule, that power, once it begins to lie to itself, must go on lying, until there is nothing left but masks, echoes, and the dust of forgotten gods.